Is there any way to escape the truth? You can't forget something like that. It's not the kind of thing where you get drunk and wake up with a blank slate. Too much happened. I don't remember. I swear I don't remember what I did to that girl. But you did it. No, never. You did it. Your DNA was there. It doesn't disappear. We have to get past this thing where you say you don't remember, Edgar, because how do you think the jury is going to look at that? I don't care what they think. I don't remember. If I don't remember, then I didn't do it. Are you sure you're okay? No, no. I didn't do it. Are you ready to keep going? Yeah, okay. After hearing this conversation, do you think he's actually innocent? Hold that thought until the end of the video. Today we're heading to Connecticut, where a 14-year-old girl named Clara Whitlock vanished on a quiet evening right from her own home. No screams, no signs of break-in, just silence that has lasted over 30 years. The case went cold, time passed, and the truth was buried under layers of lies, until, from a different case in a different state, an old secret started bleeding out. Before we dive into the story, drop a comment and let us know where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. If you enjoy true crime stories like this, hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, turn on notifications, and share it with someone you think would like it too. That evening unfolded in the Whitlock family home like hundreds of others before it, with no warning signs that it would become the final timestamp when Clara Whitlock's presence in this world could still be confirmed with certainty. The 14-year-old stayed inside the house all evening. She didn't go out, didn't call friends, didn't ask permission to leave, didn't pack clothes or personal items for a trip. All her activities took place within the familiar family space. Clara was seen in the most ordinary places: the living room, the kitchen, on the stairs, spots where her presence was so routine that no one registered it as something worth noting. The last time Clara was seen, she was still inside the house, in the family space. There were no major arguments, no shouting, no unusual behavior that drew attention. Everything had the appearance of a normal evening, to the point that when time started passing and Clara didn't reappear, the family's first reaction wasn't panic, but waiting for her to walk out of another room, waiting for footsteps on the stairs, waiting for her bedroom door to open like it always did. But that waiting stretched beyond what was reasonable, and when her name was called with no response, unease began to form slowly but surely. The family started searching the house, from the most obvious places to the overlooked corners. Clara's bedroom showed no signs of disturbance. The bed wasn't tossed. Belongings were in their usual spots. The bathroom was empty. The kitchen was empty. All common areas were vacant. The search expanded to the entire house. Every door opened, every room checked, but Clara wasn't in any of them. There were no signs she had left in a hurry, no unauthorized doors opened, no furniture knocked over, no sounds the neighbors could have heard. The house remained in a suspiciously quiet state. Clara's absence became clearer with each passing minute, and when the family realized they couldn't locate her in their own home, anxiety escalated rapidly. The search shifted from casual to urgent, every space rechecked in hopes of missing something, but the results stayed the same. Clara wasn't there, she wasn't anywhere the family could reach, and there were no signs she had exited the house through normal means. The silence of the family space was no longer familiar, but a terrifying void, because Clara's absence came with no explanation, no note, no message, no signs of preparation. Only one undeniable fact emerged: Clara Whitlock had vanished, and that vanishing happened while she was supposed to be in the safest place, her own home. When they realized internal searching yielded no clues, and time kept passing without any sign of her return, the family had to face the gravest possibility, that this was no longer an ordinary delay or misunderstanding, but a situation beyond their ability to resolve alone. The decision to contact police was made in tension and confusion, not because they understood what was happening, but because they had no other way to explain Clara's complete disappearance within the home. The missing person report was made in that context, marking the moment a 14-year-old girl's absence officially became a missing persons case, requiring law enforcement intervention. closing the final evening, when Clara Whitlock was confirmed to have been in the house with her family. The missing person report was received as an emergency by the local police department, where initial details about a minor with unknown whereabouts were immediately logged under high-priority protocol. In the incident response system, all cases involving anyone under 18 are classified as special risk, requiring rapid and direct action. Clara Whitlock's name, age 14, was entered into the intake report, along with the last confirmed time she was in the home, the lack of contact, no return after many hours, and no reasonable explanation. This officially opened a missing juvenile file, triggering standard procedures for child disappearances, including dispatching officers to the scene that same night, to verify information, assess the situation, and rule out misunderstandings or personal incidents. When the first officers arrived at the Whitlock home, they approached the case in the trained sequence, prioritizing factual data collection before any conclusions. Clara's identity was confirmed, age verified, last sighting time clarified with family members for consistency. Officers asked basic questions to determine if this was a voluntary runaway or involved coercion. In this phase, initial information gathering is foundational. Any errors or rushed assumptions could directly impact later investigation directions. Officers noted Clara was last seen in the family space, with no known plans to leave, no calls to friends or relatives, no reported serious conflicts right before disappearance. These details were logged as final confirmed points of the victim's presence. Concurrently, police conducted a quick home verification to gauge urgency. Checking entry-exit points for signs, Clara left voluntarily, or was taken without obvious traces. No immediate signs of violent entry, no broken doors, no overturned furniture, presented officers with a familiar but complex puzzle, a minor vanishing without visible evidence. The next decision was to activate an appropriate emergency investigation, including internal alerts to prevent delays, assigning personnel to track the file, and preparing for expanded searches if needed. Opening a missing juvenile file was more than administrative. It signaled the case had exceeded family self-resolution, entering systematic law enforcement intervention. Officers gathered structured information from the family, detailed habits, close relationships, that day's schedule, any factors for initial direction. They maintained scene order to avoid disturbing potential evidence. Though no clear crime signs initially, the case nature required caution. Early hours in child disappearances are critical for outcomes. Emergency activation prioritized Clara's file, allowing continuous updates and readiness for wider searches on new leads. Officers assessed family cooperation and statement consistency, not to suspect immediately, but to ensure accuracy and cross-verification, as minor details here often anchor later steps. As night wore on, no change, Clara unfound, no calls or contact, reinforcing this wasn't routine delay. Officers tracked time since last sighting, updating systematically. In processing the report, police considered common juvenile scenarios: short voluntary leave, enticement, or danger, but lacked data to rule out any. Strategy: keep all directions open, focus on firm facts. Officer dispatch not only verified but established official presence, assuring family serious handling, while for police it ensured legal foundation for actions. With file complete and emergency investigation activated, Clara Whitlock's case entered a phase where every action, decision, evaluation was documented, no longer private family matter, but law enforcement jurisdiction. Key here: from police intake, Clara's disappearance shifted from family worry to official high-priority juvenile missing case with file, assigned personnel, activated investigation, though no one knew then what initial steps would lead to, or how long her absence would last. Immediately after opening the missing juvenile file and activating emergency investigation, officers shifted focus to scene search to determine if Clara Whitlock's disappearance left any physical signs in the home. In residence disappearances, The scene is often the most vital source to distinguish voluntary departure from coercion. The search followed systematic order, common areas first, then full house. Each room approached methodically, to avoid missing minor details with future value. Living room, kitchen, hallways, stairs, common spaces checked first for unusual disturbance, but furniture remained in usual positions. No overturning, no items scattered beyond normal use. This noted if an unusual event occurred, it left no obvious traces in public areas. Next, private rooms, Clara's bedroom, others, bathrooms, laundry, attic, spaces where victims might hide or pass in leaving. Clara's bedroom examined thoroughly, reflecting pre-disappearance state. Bed not tossed, bedding undisturbed in struggle way, desk and personal items usual, no blood, no damage, no breaks or fragments, all notably normal, as coercion often leaves, at least minor physical signs, making absence of traces key data. Entry at sections ran parallel, main, side, back doors, windows assessed for exit path if any. Officers looked for pry marks, broken locks, unauthorized opening, but initial results, all normal, no external entry signs, no forced locks, no scratches or stranger intrusion attempts. This reduced violent abduction entry likelihood then, raising questions how Clara could leave without normal exits. Officers evaluated surroundings, porches, steps, wall areas for footprints, drag marks, unusual movement, but no clear traces in initial check. No struggle signs throughout house was key conclusion, ruled out, open fight or major violence in family space at disappearance. However, didn't fully exclude coercion, only that if something happened, it was without obvious chaos. Officers then evaluated voluntary leave likelihood based on scene. Runaway scenarios usually show signs, packed items, unusual bedroom state, active departure from routine space, but checks showed no clear trip preparation, reducing voluntary hypothesis persuasiveness, though not fully excluded. Officers considered normal state leave without much belongings or traces, but this raised motive styming questions, as voluntary teen leave without family notice or physical signs is uncommon in normal household. Entire scene search cautious to preserve initial state, all observations documented for later review. Preliminary conclusions eliminative, not affirmative, no direct evidence of violent coercion in house. No clear evidence of usual voluntary departure. Combination made scene neutral, no clear answers, only more questions. Established here full house checked, entries evaluated, no clear struggle coercion signs found, voluntary leave, considered but not supported by scene, closing search phase with concerning reality, that Clara Whitlock's disappearance left no immediate explanatory physical traces in the last place she was seen. After the thorough search of the entire crime scene inside the house yielded no physical evidence that could explain Clara Whitlock's disappearance, the focus of the investigation expanded to the surrounding area, with the assumption that if Clara had left the house in any way, whether voluntarily or not, that movement might have left traces outside the family property. The officers began organizing a search in the immediate radius around the house, checking the front yard, backyard, areas adjacent to the fence, walkways, lawns, and any spaces that could obscure visibility, because in many cases, footprints, dropped items, or minor disturbances in the outdoor environment can provide critical clues. However, the initial search uncovered no unusual signs. The ground showed no drag marks, no clear footprints, no abandoned personal belongings, and this made the hypothesis that Clara had left the house immediately difficult to establish with evidence. From the immediate vicinity, the sweep expanded along nearby roadways, including routes Clara could have accessed if she left on foot. The officers walked along sidewalks, checked curbs, intersections, and poorly lit areas, where someone might stop or turn without being easily noticed. During this process, police also noted the time of night and the level of activity in the surrounding area, because an unusual movement by a teenager in the evening would likely have been noticed by others. but there was no indication that Clara had appeared on these routes after the last time she was seen. Concurrently with the sweep of nearby roads, nearby public areas were also checked, including a small park, bus stops, convenience stores, parking lots, and locations a teenager might visit if leaving the house under normal circumstances. The officers looked for signs of Clara's presence, such as questioning attendants, employees, or anyone present in the area at the relevant time, but the responses obtained did not confirm any sighting of Clara. No one recalled seeing a 14-year-old girl matching the description during that time frame, and this heightened the sense that Clara's disappearance had occurred in a way that left no public trace. The process of gathering witness information was conducted in parallel. Police went door to door in the neighboring area to ask if anyone had seen Clara leave the house, heard unusual noises, or observed a stranger or suspicious vehicle during the relevant period. The questions were asked systematically to ensure no detail was missed. But the information collected was either general or unverifiable. Some people were not home at the time, others paid no attention to what was happening around them, and no one provided a specific description that could be directly linked to Clara. The absence of confirming witnesses left the area search lacking a foothold, because in many missing persons cases, even a single reliable confirmation of seeing the victim at a specific location can open an entirely new investigative direction. But here, every sweep effort returned to zero. The officers continued checking areas that might have been overlooked, such as little-used shortcuts, vacant lots, densely wooded areas, or nearby abandoned structures, with the goal of ruling out the possibility that Clara had entered an unsafe space and encountered an accident. However, this checking also yielded no specific results. No items were found, no signs of movement, and no evidence that Clara had been present in those places after leaving the house. Throughout the area search process, the officers maintained detailed records of each step taken, each location checked, and each piece of information gathered, because in missing persons investigations, knowing exactly what has been done is nearly as important as finding clues. It helps avoid duplicating efforts, and clearly identifies gaps that need re-examination if new information emerges. The absence of verifiable results in this phase began to form a troubling picture, because it suggested that if Clara had left the house, it had happened in a way that left no trace in public spaces, did not attract neighbors' attention, was not remembered by any witness, and created no physical signs that police could follow. This raised two main possibilities in internal assessments. Either Clara had left the house in a very brief window, and in a discreet manner that no one noticed, or her disappearance did not follow a typical scenario of free movement, but at this point, there was not enough evidence to lean firmly toward either possibility. The area search process continued until the officers could confirm that the highest probability locations had been checked, and potential witness sources had been approached. The final outcome of this phase was clearly recorded in the file, that the search around the house, sweeps of nearby routes, checks of public areas, and witness information gathering yielded no verifiable results that could determine Clara Whitlock's location or direction of movement, and the lack of clues in the space outside the house made the case more complicated, as it reinforced the reality that Clara's disappearance left no clear traces in the area she could naturally access, closing the area search phase with a concerning conclusion that every effort to expand the investigation outward failed to narrow the gap between the scene and the truth about Clara's whereabouts at that time. When the search in the area surrounding the house yielded no verifiable results, the investigative focus was forced to return to the interior space of the Whitlock family home, this time with a more detailed and systematic approach, concentrating on inventorying belongings to determine whether any items had disappeared at the same time. Clara Whitlock was no longer present, because in many missing persons cases, items taken or left behind often directly reflect the circumstances and motive of the disappearance. The officers requested the family's participation in this sweep to ensure accuracy, starting with Clara's personal belongings and extending to shared household property. Each area was carefully rechecked, from Clara's bedroom, closets, storage rooms, to less noticed places, to identify any changes from the normal state of living prior to that. During the inventory, the first detail confirmed was that a small travel suitcase was no longer in its usual place in the house. This suitcase was not one regularly used, nor an item Clara carried daily. Its disappearance was noted by the family as a significant change, since no one in the house recalled using or moving the suitcase recently. The absence of the suitcase was reported to police, and considered as a factor potentially directly related to Clara's disappearance, because in the context of a minor no longer at home, the absence of an item used to hold personal belongings can carry multiple meanings. Next, the inventory continued to expand to shared family property, and another detail was discovered. The tax refund money the family had recently received was no longer in its usual storage place. This money was not cash used daily, but was typically kept for specific expenses. Its disappearance was not explained by any transaction or need. The family recalled, this shortfall was recorded as a second anomaly, increasing the seriousness of the situation, as it suggested Clara's disappearance might have been accompanied by a sum of cash leaving the house. While there was no evidence yet that she had taken the money herself, the inventory did not stop there, because when the officers asked the family to check areas related to other members, another small but noteworthy detail was discovered. The coins in June Holloway's piggy bank, Clara's younger sister, were no longer intact as before. The piggy bank was used to store spare change, more symbolic than of significant financial value, but the fact that money had been taken from it became a detail the officers had to note, because in missing persons cases, low value but random items sometimes reflect hurried actions or an unprepared scenario. These three details, the small travel suitcase, the tax refund money, and the coins in the piggy bank, were placed side by side in internal evaluation, and formed a set of related items requiring serious consideration. The officers re-verified with each family member to ensure there was no mistake, that these items had indeed disappeared during the period. Clara was no longer at home, and not as a result of prior use. No one clearly remembered. After confirmation, the missing items were listed in detail in the file, along with descriptions, usual storage locations, and the last known time. This recording was not intended to draw immediate conclusions, but to create a foundation for subsequent analyses of the disappearance context, as each item could provide clues about behavior, intent, or circumstances for Clara at that time. In the evaluation process, the officers noted that the small travel suitcase was not the type typically used for short day trips, and its being taken did not fit a temporary departure, while the tax refund money and piggy bank coins, in terms of value, were not large sums sufficient to support independent living. This made explaining the disappearance of the items more complicated, because if Clara left voluntarily, the motive for taking these items was not entirely clear, whereas if other factors were involved, the combination of missing items suggested a scenario not easily defined. All these details were recorded by the officers in a neutral manner, without assigning meaning beyond what the data allowed, because at this stage, the primary task was to collect and store accurate information, avoiding subjective assumptions dominating the investigation. The discovery of related items marked an important turning point in handling the case, because for the first time since Clara disappeared, there were specific elements showing changes in the family's property state, coinciding with the time she was no longer present, and this provided police with a new data set to analyze, even though no immediate conclusions could be drawn. The officers also noted that the missing items being discovered after the area search yielded no results could influence the overall case assessment, as it shifted focus from determining where Clara might have gone to better understanding what happened inside the house, before, or at the moment she disappeared. The entire inventory process was completed with the missing items officially recorded in Clara Whitlock's missing persons file, along with necessary details for future comparison and cross-checking. And within the scope of this part, What was clearly established was that Clara's disappearance was not simply a person no longer being in the house, but was accompanied by the absence of specific items. These items became important data points, retained in the investigative file as factors needing explanation, closing the phase of discovering and recording related items with a more complex picture of the disappearance circumstances, where each missing detail raised additional questions about the manner and reason Clara Whitlock was no longer there. After the missing items were fully recorded in the file, the case processing shifted to an analysis phase, to shape the initial investigative direction, because at this point, what police had was not evidence of a clear criminal act, but a collection of disparate facts needing placement in a logical framework to assess risk level and choose appropriate strategy. The small travel suitcase, tax refund money, and piggy bank coins were examined as behavioral indicators, each item analyzed individually and in relation to the others to determine which scenario they best fit. The taking of a suitcase could suggest intent to leave the house for longer than a short trip, but the suitcase size did not indicate preparation for independent living, while the tax refund money, in value terms, was insufficient for long-term sustenance, and the piggy bank coins, rationally, had almost no practical value for a calculated departure plan. The combination of these three factors created an inconsistent picture, but when placed in the context of a 14-year-old minor, they began to be interpreted differently. The investigators assessed Clara's age as a central factor in forming hypotheses, because at that age, financial independence capability, ability to organize a long-term departure, and ability to maintain safe contact were all limited. This made complex scenarios like planning a complete disappearance less feasible, while highlighting another possibility, that if Clara left, the action might have been impulsive, poorly prepared, and based on what she could access at the moment. In internal discussions, the runaway hypothesis began to form as the explanation seeming most consistent with the existing facts, not because it was convincingly proven, but because it helped explain Clara's absence along with some items and cash being taken. While the scene showed no signs of force or violence, the formation of this hypothesis did not occur in a single decision, but as a result of elimination, as other possibilities like violent intrusion, public abduction, or accident in the nearby area, all lacked supporting evidence at that time. The runaway hypothesis was recorded as the primary investigative direction, leading to adjustments in scope and priority of investigative measures. Once the case was viewed primarily through the lens of a teenage runaway, the criminal investigation focus began to narrow, because resources are typically allocated differently between a missing persons case suspected of criminal elements and a runaway case. The investigators focused more on gathering information about friends, school, and Clara's social relationships, while higher intervention measures, such as prolonged scene lockdown or deployment of advanced investigative techniques, were no longer top priorities. This narrowing did not happen abruptly, but through small decisions, gradually eliminating or postponing approaches typically used in suspected serious crimes, such as not expanding forensic searches in the house due to no signs of struggle, or not immediately activating interagency resources due to lack of basis for believing Clara was in immediate danger. In internal exchanges, the investigators also considered psychological and behavioral factors of teenagers, because at that age, leaving home in a heightened emotional state can occur without clear explanation, and taking items like a small suitcase or available cash can reflect an impulsive decision, rather than a carefully prepared plan. This interpretation helped reinforce the runaway hypothesis as a reasonable short-term investigative direction, while reducing pressure to immediately prove a criminal scenario without direct evidence. The result of this orientation process was a cautious but limited initial investigative strategy, in which some advanced criminal investigative measures were eliminated or temporarily not deployed, not because they were deemed unnecessary in all cases, but because they were not assessed as fitting the prioritized hypothesis at that time. This included not expanding scene searches beyond what had been done, not requesting additional forensic technical support, and not activating procedures for cases showing signs of violence. In the file, these decisions were recorded as steps based on available data, reflecting how the system handled the case according to risk classification logic, and at this stage, Clara Whitlock's disappearance was primarily shaped as a case of a teenager leaving home under unclear circumstances, with the missing items and victim's age playing key roles in forming the hypothesis and narrowing the criminal investigative scope, closing this part by establishing an initial direction for the case, where resources were adjusted according to the assumption that Clara might have voluntarily left the house, even though no direct evidence proved it. After the initial investigation direction was shaped around the hypothesis that Clara Whitlock had voluntarily left home, the handling of the case gradually entered a prolonged period of stagnation, as subsequent efforts to gather information did not yield any new data that could significantly alter or strengthen the hypothesis being applied. Additional searches were conducted within the scope permitted by this investigative direction, but over time, the number of verifiable leads did not increase. Reported sightings were received sporadically but could not be confirmed. No information led to locating Clara or clarifying her movements after the time of her disappearance. Every lead examined ended in a dead end or lacked sufficient reliability to expand the investigation, and this caused the case file to gradually lose momentum. Alongside the lack of new leads, the absence of clear evidence of a crime continued to influence the assessment of the case. Everything recorded up to that point remained consistent with a scenario showing no confirmed signs of coercion or violence, no crime scene, no physical evidence indicating a criminal act had occurred in or around the home, and no legal grounds strong enough to shift the case to a deeper criminal investigation. In that context, investigators were forced to work within a restricted legal framework, where every decision to expand the investigation required justification by specific data, but that data never appeared. Another important factor contributing to the case's stagnation was the lack of family DNA for future comparisons. Clara was adopted, and at that time, accessing information about the biological family was neither a simple nor prioritized process in runaway cases. This meant the investigating agency had no DNA samples from blood relatives on file for storage or use if remains or biological samples needed matching later. This deficiency did not immediately affect the initial investigation, but it created a serious gap in the file, severely limiting the ability to verify identity in the worst-case scenarios. As time passed without new developments, Clara Whitlock's file gradually came under review from a resource management perspective. In the law enforcement system, cases that produce no new leads over a certain period often face a downgrade in priority, not because they are less important, but because limited resources require units to focus on cases with higher potential for progress. In this instance, the absence of clear criminal evidence, verifiable leads, and new legal tools led to Clara's file being moved to passive monitoring status. Updates were made only when external information came in, rather than through proactive investigative measures. The decision to classify the file as a cold case came after a comprehensive evaluation of these factors. It was not a conclusive determination about Clara's fate, but a change in how the case was managed, reflecting the reality that current investigative methods had been exhausted without results. This status change meant the file was archived in the system for unsolved cases no longer under regular active investigation. From that point, proactive investigative efforts largely ceased, no more large-scale searches, no periodic reviews of old leads, and no dedicated personnel assigned to follow the case on a daily or weekly basis. Instead, the file was maintained in a state ready to be reopened if new information emerged, but without any active investigative strategy driving it. The halt in active investigation did not happen in a single moment, but was the result of a gradual decline in the intensity and frequency of activities. Internal meetings about the case became infrequent, update reports simply noted no new developments, and Clara's disappearance gradually became an entry on the list of unsolved cases, existing in the system as an open file but without any specific direction. In that context, Clara Whitlock's disappearance was no longer treated as an emergency requiring immediate response, but as a lingering case entirely dependent on the possible emergence of external leads. The operational freezing of the file did not reflect a conclusion that Clara was safe or had met harm. It reflected the limits of what the system could do with the available data and tools at the time. The combination of no new leads emerging, no clear criminal evidence, and no family DNA created a practical wall that investigators could not overcome. When the file was officially moved to cold case status, Clara Whitlock's case entered a new phase where time became the sole dominating factor, and any answers about the girl's disappearance, if they existed, would have to await a change from outside the now stilled investigative system. After Clara Whitlock's file was moved to cold case status and all proactive investigation ceased, the case existed in the system as an unresolved set of documents with no significant updates until a completely different approach emerged from outside the traditional investigative structure. It originated from an independent review of long unsolved missing persons cases, a process not based on the agency's initial assumptions, but on broader data, cross-referencing, that included missing persons files and unidentified decedent cases. During this review, Clara's file was pulled from its static state and placed into a larger set of similar cases, with the goal of identifying overlaps that may have been missed during the original investigation. A specific hypothesis began to form when Clara's information was compared to the file of a Jane Doe who had been discovered in a different context, at a location and time not directly connected to the original disappearance. This comparison was not random, but based on basic criteria such as gender, estimated age at time of death, time elapsed since discovery, and certain biological characteristics matching Clara's description when alive. In the early stage of this process, the hypothesis that Clara might be the Jane Doe was not treated as a conclusion, but as a possibility requiring verification. However, the initial degree of similarity was enough to prevent the hypothesis from being dismissed. The evaluation of similarity was conducted systematically, with each factor examined side by side, from matching age range and estimated physical build to the plausibility of geographic movement in the interval between the two events. These factors were analyzed independently of the prior runaway hypothesis to avoid old biases influencing the interpretation of new data. In the evaluation process, the new hypothesis did not aim to completely negate what had been established before, but to open another possibility that Clara may have left her initial area and met an end not recorded in the missing persons file. The existence of a long unidentified Jane Doe raised questions about a potential link between the two files, especially given the lack of stored family DNA from the time of Clara's disappearance. Once this hypothesis was developed in sufficient detail, it was presented as a new investigative proposal, not to assert certainty, but to request verification using currently available scientific methods. Proposing this hypothesis marked a significant shift in the approach to the case, as for the first time in years, Clara's file was examined from the perspective of an unidentified death, rather than solely as a missing person of unknown cause. Within the framework of the new hypothesis, the focus was no longer on how Clara left home, but on whether she might have become an unrecognized victim in another file. This process required coordination across different data sources and the submission of information to the appropriate authorities to assess the possibility of partially reopening the file in a new direction. All information related to the hypothesis was compiled and sent to the investigating agency, accompanied by an analysis of the degree of similarity and the reasons this approach merited consideration. Submitting this information did not mean the case was officially reopened, but it broke the long freeze by introducing a new question based on data and methods not previously applied. Within the scope of this section, what is established is the emergence of a new hypothesis built from reviewing unsolved missing persons cases and cross-referencing with a specific Jane Doe. This hypothesis was judged to have sufficient similarity to warrant verification, was formally proposed, and was forwarded to the authorities as a potential investigative direction, opening the possibility that Clara Whitlock's disappearance might be explained through another file that had existed in parallel for years without ever being connected. Immediately after the new hypothesis was submitted to the authorities, the first step in testing it did not involve the scene or witnesses, but a complete review of the legal and biological foundation of Clara Whitlock's file. To determine the feasibility of comparing it to a Jane Doe, the prerequisite was to clarify Clara's adoption status and the ability to access suitable biological DNA. Investigators confirmed that Clara was not the Whitlock's biological child, but had been legally adopted, and this information immediately altered the structure of hypothesis testing, since the prior file contained no stored DNA samples from blood relatives, meaning any past forensic comparisons had been impossible. Confirming the adoption status triggered the need to access the sealed adoption records under law. This process required legal intervention to obtain information about the birth mother, as only biological DNA from the original family would allow scientific testing of the Jane Doe hypothesis. Investigators began tracing Clara's birth mother based on adoption records stored in the state where the adoption occurred. This process was not quick, as old records often lacked digitization and required manual cross-checking, but eventually Kathleen Price was identified as the woman who had given birth to Clara before placing her for adoption. Identifying the birth mother was not merely administrative, it opened the first opportunity to collect biological DNA directly related to Clara. Investigators contacted Kathleen Price to inform her of the case status and request cooperation in testing the new hypothesis. The DNA sample collection was conducted according to strict forensic protocols to ensure validity and admissibility in official comparisons. The biological sample was taken, sealed, and documented with a chain of custody to prevent any challenges to its integrity. Parallel to collecting the DNA sample, investigators began preparing for the forensic comparison, including determining the type of samples available from the Jane Doe file, their preservation condition, and the feasibility of extracting genetic data compatible with current technology. This was a critical step in assessing viability, as not all unidentified dissident cases have sufficient biological material for comparison. In this instance, the existence of stored biological samples from the Jane Doe allowed comparison to proceed, but the process required coordination among multiple agencies beyond the scope of a single local authority. Federal coordination was therefore activated to ensure legal, technical, and scientific procedures were carried out in sync. The involved agencies exchanged information, confirmed jurisdiction, and agreed on protocols to avoid errors that could invalidate results. In this hypothesis testing phase, the focus was not on asserting that Clara was the Jane Doe, but on building a verifiable chain of testing that could provide a definitive answer, whether confirmation or exclusion. Investigators were aware that a negative result would also hold great value, as it would eliminate a time-consuming line of inquiry and clear the way for re-examining all assumptions about Clara's fate. Federal coordination served not only technical support but also to ensure that if the hypothesis was confirmed, subsequent steps could be implemented quickly and legally. The entire testing process was conducted with high caution, as this was the first time in years that Clara's file had been placed in a specific forensic context. Any errors at this stage could lead to incorrect conclusions or serious legal consequences. When the DNA samples were collected and prepared for comparison, and the involved agencies had agreed on the protocol, the Jane Doe hypothesis officially entered the scientific testing phase, marking an important transition from file-based speculation to seeking answers through biological evidence. Within the scope of this section, what is established is that the necessary conditions for testing the hypothesis were put in place, from confirming adoption status, tracing the birth mother, collecting biological DNA samples, preparing for forensic comparison, to federal coordination, creating a solid foundation for the new hypothesis to be tested accurately and indisputably. Once the legal and technical conditions for testing the hypothesis had been fully established, the DNA comparison process was carried out as the decisive step to determine whether the Jane Doe case being matched was truly related to Clara Whitlock or not. The biological samples were processed according to standard procedures. The genetic data obtained from Clara's biological mother was entered into the system for comparison with the DNA extracted from Jane Doe's remains, and this process took place in a strictly controlled environment to ensure accuracy and eliminate any possibility of interference or error. When the analysis results were completed, the data returned showed no biological relationship between the two sets of samples, meaning that Jane Doe was not Clara. This exclusion result was scientifically conclusive and left no room for subjective interpretation. For the investigators, this was a moment that was both conclusive and pivotal, as it ended an approach that had been expected to explain the years-long disappearance, while forcing the entire investigation process to return to the starting point, with a new understanding that Clara was not in the Jane Doe case under review. Receiving the exclusion result was not merely about eliminating a hypothesis, it also entailed re-evaluating all the prior assumptions, particularly the runaway hypothesis that had been formed right from the early stages of the case. In the previous context, the possibility that Clara had voluntarily left home and lived a different life, though unconfirmed, had remained as an open explanation. However, the DNA result excluding Jane Doe significantly weakened that scenario, because if Clara had not become an unidentified death case in the matched record, and had left no trace in other recording systems, then the likelihood that she had maintained a long-term anonymous life became increasingly unconvincing. The investigators began narrowing the possibility that Clara was still alive after the disappearance, not based on emotion, but by gradually excluding possible scenarios based on the available data. The complete absence of traces in administrative, medical, educational, and legal systems, combined with the DNA result negating the Jane Doe hypothesis, led to a cautious assessment that Clara likely did not live long after the moment of disappearance. Re-evaluating the runaway hypothesis became a necessary step in this phase. The investigators revisited the factors that had once supported that direction, including the missing items and the victim's age, but in light of the new results, those factors were no longer strong enough to sustain the hypothesis as a central explanation, especially since there was no independent evidence showing that Clara had ever appeared at another location after leaving home. The combination of excluding Jane Doe and finding no traces of survival forced the investigation direction to change, from searching for a person who might be living somewhere to considering the possibility that Clara's disappearance could be linked to a more serious outcome that had not been detected at the time of the incident. The adjustment in investigation direction did not happen abruptly, but through internal evaluations, where investigators discussed the meaning of the DNA results and how they affected the overall case picture. In these evaluations, the focus was no longer on where Clara had gone, but on what might have happened during or immediately after the moment she disappeared. This led to a shift in how old facts were viewed. Details once seen as fitting the runaway hypothesis were now re-examined from a different angle, such as taking items of limited value, or leaving no traces of movement in public spaces. Narrowing the possibility that Clara was still alive did not mean reaching a final conclusion about her fate, but it created a clear boundary for subsequent investigation directions, eliminating scenarios that were no longer viable and focusing on the remaining possibilities. Within the framework of this part, what was established as important was that a wrong direction had been excluded by scientific evidence. The Jane Doe hypothesis was rejected, the runaway hypothesis was severely weakened, and the entire investigation process was adjusted to reflect the reality that Clara Whitlock's disappearance was more likely not a prolonged voluntary departure from home, but an event of a more serious nature, requiring the re-examination of initial facts under a different lens. Closing the phase of excluding the wrong direction with a case picture that had changed significantly compared to what had been believed for many years prior. After the Jane Doe hypothesis was excluded by scientific evidence, and the possibility that Clara Whitlock was still alive after the disappearance was significantly narrowed, the investigation process was forced to return to the original starting point, but with a completely different lens. Instead of searching for traces outside or long-term movement scenarios, the investigators shifted focus to scrutinizing inside Clara's foster family, viewing it as the last space confirmed to have her presence and the place where all previous assumptions had once been considered safe. The Holloway family file was reopened and reviewed comprehensively, not just at the basic information level but also in administrative documents, residence history, social relationships, and interactions recorded before and after the time Clara disappeared. This review process was not aimed at finding a single detail but at rebuilding the overall picture of the family environment in which Clara had lived. In the new investigation context, factors once seen as unrelated or insufficiently significant began to be placed back into the chain of events, from how the family reacted in the first days after Clara disappeared to the degree of cooperation and consistency of the information provided over time. Parallel to reviewing the family file, the investigators revisited the criminal record and legal history of Edgar Holloway, the foster father, with the assumption that if Clara's disappearance was not a random or voluntary event, then evaluating the behavioral history of those closest to her was an unavoidable step. This process led to re-examining old legal records, including cases that had been handled, allegations that had been recorded, and information scattered across various storage systems. When these documents were compiled again, a picture of Edgar's past violent behavior began to emerge more clearly than how it had been viewed in the early stage of the case. The investigators assessed these incidents, not just based on prior legal conclusions, but on the nature of the behavior, the circumstances of occurrence, and the severity, to determine if there was any similarity between past behaviors and the context of Clara's disappearance. Evaluating past violent behavior did not stop at listing incidents, but focused on analyzing how Edgar acted, how he controlled his surroundings, and how those behaviors were concealed or downplayed in official records. When these facts were placed side by side, the investigators began identifying repeating behavioral patterns, including a tendency to use violence or threats in private spaces, the ability to manipulate situations to avoid outside attention, and maintaining a stable image in the community, while serious behaviors occurred behind the family door. These patterns were analyzed, not to speculate on motive emotionally, but to assess the likelihood that the family environment may not have been as safe as initially assumed. In this context, the investigators also examined the roles of other family members, particularly how information was communicated and controlled after Clara disappeared, the consistency in accounts, the timing of providing information, and reactions to difficult questions were all placed under a new perspective to determine if there were signs of concealment, avoidance, or restructuring the story over time. The process of identifying suspicion within the family did not occur in a hasty conclusion, but was the result of systematically connecting facts that had long existed but had never been linked. The combination of Edgar's history of violent behavior, control patterns, and closed family environment, along with Clara disappearing without leaving external traces, began to create a new assumption that the case's focus might lie right within the foster family itself. This assumption was not presented as an official accusation, but as an investigation direction that needed priority consideration in the next phase, because it fit better with the excluded facts and what remained after other directions were no longer viable. Within the framework of this part, what was established was that the investigation process had shifted from seeking answers outside to confronting the possibility that Clara Whitlock's disappearance might originate from the very family environment in which she lived. With Edgar Holloway becoming a focal point of suspicion based on behavioral history, identified patterns, and gaps in how the case had been handled previously, closing the phase of investigating back into the foster family with a fundamental change in how the case was viewed, where initial safe assumptions were no longer taken as default, and all data related to the Holloway family was placed in a state requiring rigorous verification. From the moment suspicion within the Holloway family was established as a key investigation direction, the investigators clearly recognized that any answer to Clara Whitlock's disappearance could not be found if relying only on what had been processed within the initial case file framework, and therefore a mandatory step was to go back through the entire old document system, especially reports that had been recorded but not fully integrated into the prior investigation process. This review process was not limited to police files directly related to the missing person case, but extended to school documents, social service agency records, and other administrative reports related to Clara in the time before she disappeared. In that review process, an old report related to Clara was discovered, existing in the system as an isolated document, not clearly linked to the missing person file. This report was created before the time Clara disappeared and reflected concerns about her safety in the family environment. The discovery of this document immediately became a major point of attention, as it provided evidence that warning signs had once been officially recorded, but not considered as a factor that could influence how the case was evaluated afterward. The investigators proceeded to evaluate the report's content in detail, examining the language used, the specificity of the recorded information, and the context in which the report was created. The content showed that Clara had expressed concerns or fear related to returning home, and although the report did not describe a specific criminal act in detail, it reflected a serious tense situation in the family environment, which if properly handled at that time, could have led to different intervention measures. The evaluation process did not stop at the report's content, but extended to reviewing how this report had been handled at the time it was created. The investigators checked which agencies the report had been forwarded to, whether any follow-up actions were recorded, and whether any monitoring or intervention measures had been implemented after the report was received. The review results showed that the report had been recorded, but did not lead to subsequent protective or investigative steps. There were no records showing long-term follow-up, no documents reflecting coordination between related agencies, and no evidence that this report had ever been re-examined after Clara disappeared. Identifying this limited handling highlighted a systemic deficiency, where a warning signal related to a minor's safety had not been integrated into subsequent risk assessments. The investigators analyzed the causes of this deficiency in the context of that time, including administrative procedures, how the severity of the report was classified, and assumptions about a safe family environment. But regardless of the cause, the consequence was that important information had not been used when the disappearance occurred. The process of identifying systemic deficiencies was not aimed at seeking individual responsibility, but at understanding how information had been fragmented and lost its effect in the overall investigation process. The investigators noted that if this report had been considered along with other facts from the beginning, the formation of the runaway hypothesis might have been evaluated more cautiously, and the initial investigation scope might not have been narrowed so quickly. In the current phase, this old report was officially added to the active investigation file, no longer existing as a disparate document, but integrated into the chain of facts to be considered along with new findings about the Holloway family and Edgar's behavioral history. This addition was not just archival but also changed how the investigators evaluated the entire context of the disappearance, as it provided a piece showing that Clara had once been in a state of unease before disappearing, something that had not been reflected in prior official evaluations. Within the framework of this part, what was established was the existence of an old report related to Clara's safety. The re-evaluation of its content and handling had exposed systemic deficiencies in the initial process, and adding this document to the current file had strengthened the internal family investigation direction, not as speculation, but as a logical result of connecting facts that had been overlooked for many years. Closing the phase of reviewing overlooked documents with a clear awareness that Clara Whitlock's disappearance was not only a story about what happened, but also a story about what was not seen, not connected, and not handled properly when it could have made a difference. After the previously overlooked documents were fully integrated into the current case file, and the internal family investigation direction regarding the Halloways was logically strengthened, the investigative process seemed to have advanced very close to a substantive turning point when it encountered the most serious obstacle since the case was reopened. A legal deadlock, a state that did not stem from a lack of effort or lack of suspicion, but from the rigid limitations of the criminal procedure system itself, where every coercive action must be based on specific, court-provable evidence. First and foremost, the core and unavoidable issue was the absence of Clara Whitlock's body. The lack of a body was not just a physical deficiency, but a decisive legal void, because in most murder cases, the body is the central piece of evidence to establish that a crime has actually occurred. Without a body, it was impossible to determine the cause of death, the mechanism of death, the time of death, or to establish a direct link between a specific individual's actions and the fatal outcome. Although the investigators believed that Clara was most likely no longer alive shortly after her disappearance, that belief held no legal value without supporting physical evidence. Paralleling the absence of a body was the lack of an identified crime scene. The house from which Clara disappeared had been searched in 1989 under entirely different circumstances, when the runaway hypothesis dominated the entire approach. The scene at that time was not preserved as a homicide scene. There was no prolonged lockdown, no collection of trace evidence, no in-depth forensic analysis, and most importantly, nothing was recorded as abnormal enough to trigger long-term scene preservation procedures. By the time the investigation was reopened, the physical space had changed over time. Furniture, structure, even ownership were no longer in their original state from the year of the incident, making the recreation of a crime scene nearly impossible. The absence of a scene meant that all efforts to reconstruct the chain of events could only rely on statements, documents, and inference, elements that are inherently fragile when subjected to the strict proof requirements of criminal law. In this context, the consulted prosecutors had to face the key question whether the existing suspicions were sufficient to file criminal charges, and the answer, though unwelcome, was no. To charge an individual, the justice system requires proof of two basic elements: that a crime has occurred, and that the suspect is highly likely to have committed it. In Edgar Halloway's case, the investigators could point to a history of violent behavior, control patterns, inconsistencies in accounts, and overlooked data, but all of that remained at the level of reasonable suspicion, not yet reaching the threshold of strong enough evidence to surpass the probable cause standard before a judge or jury. The insufficiency of grounds for prosecution led directly to another consequence: the inability to obtain search warrants, since every search warrant must be based on a showing of high probability that evidence of a crime will be found at a specific location. Here the investigators only had suspicion that Clara might have been murdered, but no evidence that a body or physical evidence existed at any location. This lack of specific grounds meant that any search proposal, though reasonable from an investigative standpoint, could not overcome the legal barriers protecting individual privacy rights, especially when the suspect had not been charged and no new criminal conduct had occurred to serve as a basis for coercive intervention. This created a systemic vicious cycle. No evidence meant no search warrant meant no ability to search for evidence, and no new evidence meant no ability to prosecute. This loop caused the entire investigative process to fall into a state of stagnation, even though the investigators had advanced far in terms of understanding and logic compared to what had been believed for decades prior. Within the investigative team, the legal deadlock was discussed frankly and without evasion, because this was not a matter of competence or will but of legal limits. The investigators were fully aware that any action crossing the line, even with the intent of seeking truth, risked collapsing the entire case if it later went to trial. Illegally obtained evidence would not only be worthless, but could destroy the only chance to pursue criminal responsibility. Therefore, they had to exercise restraint, accepting the deadlock, rather than acting on instinct, even as time continued to pass and the risk of evidence loss grew greater. This deadlock also highlighted a bitter paradox of the system. The deeper the investigation went, and the clearer the seriousness of the case became, the more tightly bound it was by higher proof requirements. What had been overlooked in 1989, from the case classification to the failure to preserve the scene, now returned as irreversible consequences, forcing the current investigators to pay the price for decisions made in an entirely different context. Within the existing legal framework, Clara Whitlock's case existed in a dangerous gray area, where every indicator pointed to a tragic outcome, but no indicator was strong enough to trigger procedural action. The investigation could not expand in the traditional sense: no digging, no seizing, no compelled sampling, and no forcing anyone to answer beyond what they voluntarily provided. In that state, the investigators could only maintain the file in a ready status, continue reviewing data, and search for legal loopholes or entirely new sources of evidence that might break the deadlock. But within the scope of this part, the reality was clearly established that the case had reached the maximum limit of what the law permitted at that time. The legal deadlock was not the end of suspicion, but the forced suspension of action, where the truth, though very close, remained separated by the uncompromising requirements of the criminal justice system. In the context where Clara Whitlock's disappearance case had reached an insurmountable legal limit, using conventional investigative tools, the investigators were forced to seek an indirect approach, a detour that could break the deadlock without needing a body or crime scene. It was from this need that reviewing other serious cases potentially linked to the same suspect became a top priority. Among the files brought forward for review, the Rebecca Linton case in Virginia emerged as a potential intersection, not because it had an obvious connection to Clara from the start, but because the structural elements of this case could provide a valid legal entry point to Edgar Holloway, who remained at the center of suspicions, yet outside the reach of criminal proceedings. The review of the Rebecca Linton case was conducted comprehensively, starting with collecting and rereading the entire original file, including scene reports, autopsy protocols, witness statements, investigative hypotheses previously proposed, and the reasons the case remained unsolved. This review was not formal, but aimed at deeply understanding how the case had been approached at the time of occurrence, what had been done, what had been missed, and what technological or perceptual limitations might have affected the initial investigation's outcome. As the file was systematically reconstructed, the investigators began focusing on analyzing the modus operandi, viewing it as the key factor for assessing potential linkage to Edgar Holloway. The modus operandi in the Rebecca Linton case was dissected at the behavioral level, not stopping at how the victim was killed, but delving into how the perpetrator approached, controlled, inflicted harm, and left the scene. Factors such as the degree of violence, the prolongation of the act, signs of psychological and physical control, and how the scene was disturbed or left behind were all included in the analysis. The goal of this step was to determine whether the case bore the signature of an individual with a tendency toward repeated action, or was merely a random act of violence. Once these characteristics were systematized, they were compared to what had been established about Edgar Holloway's past behavior, not just based on official prior convictions, but on behavioral patterns identified during the reverse family investigation, including tendencies toward control in private spaces, escalation of violence, and especially the ability to conceal behavior over long periods without detection. This comparison did not aim for an absolute match, since each case occurred in different contexts, but to assess the degree of structural behavioral compatibility. When placed side by side, The investigators noted several noteworthy similarities, not in specific details like tools or locations, but in how the perpetrators seemed to operate. The selection of victim, the control of the situation, and the non-impulsive nature of the violence, which suggested familiarity with crossing moral boundaries. These points, though not enough to confirm a connection, were sufficient to make the Rebecca Linton case a file warranting deeper exploration. Parallel to the behavioral analysis, the investigators shifted to a legally decisive question: the status of DNA storage from the Virginia case. In the context where Clara's case lacked a body and scene, another case with validly preserved biological samples could become the key to unlocking the entire picture. The verification of DNA storage status was conducted carefully, including confirming whether biological samples existed, where they were collected from, whether they had degraded over time, and whether the chain of custody was tight enough for use in modern proceedings. This required close coordination between Virginia law enforcement agencies and federal units, as any error in this assessment could invalidate the entire investigative direction. Upon confirming that DNA samples from the Rebecca Linton case still existed and were analyzable with current technology, the investigation's strategic focus immediately shifted. For the first time after months of deadlock, a valid legal path emerged to approach Edgar Holloway, not through Clara's disappearance, but through another case with confirmed elements constituting a crime. The investigators assessed the potential linkage between the two cases at multiple levels, not limited to behavior and DNA, but also temporal, geographic, and opportunity factors. Edgar's travel history, work, obligations, and presence during periods related to the Rebecca Linton case were reviewed to determine whether he could have accessed the victim. This was done cautiously to avoid unsubstantiated attribution, as any inference could destroy the legality of the entire direction. In this evaluation process, the investigators understood clearly that they did not need to prove an immediate connection between the two cases, but only to establish that the possibility of linkage was reasonable enough to proceed with further verification steps within the legal framework. Focusing on the Rebecca Linton case was not a diversion from Clara's, but an indirect investigative strategy, where clarifying an independent file could create a domino effect, breaking through the legal protection surrounding Edgar Holloway. If Edgar could be scientifically and legally linked to a confirmed murder, the entire perception of his role in Clara's disappearance would change, opening possibilities for applying coercive investigative measures previously impossible. Within the scope of this part, what was clearly established is that the Rebecca Linton case in Virginia no longer existed as a separate file, but became a pivotal point in the overall case-breaking strategy. Through thorough review, modus operandi analysis, suspect behavior comparison, DNA storage status verification, and linkage potential assessment, the investigators identified a new direction with the potential to break the prolonged deadlock. Concluding this part with an important realization: sometimes, the key to solving a case does not lie in continuing to hammer at the wall directly in front, but in finding another door, in another place, with another victim, but with the same perpetrator's shadow behind it. From the moment the Rebecca Linton case was identified as a viable legal approach to break the prolonged deadlock in the Clara Whitlock file, the investigative focus shifted to maximizing the value of the preserved biological samples. It was here that genetic genealogy was first applied as a strategic tool, rather than merely a supporting technique. In a context with no living witnesses, no preserved crime scene, and no direct connection provable by traditional investigative means, genetic analysis opened the possibility of tracing human trails through bloodlines, an indirect path but highly accurate, if implemented correctly. The investigators, working with genetics experts, converted the DNA sample from the Rebecca Linton case into data suitable for comparison on public and semi-public genealogy databases. This process required strict adherence to legal and ethical regulations, ensuring that only platforms permitting data use for law enforcement purposes were utilized. The processed genetic data was not aimed at finding a direct match, which rarely occurs in old cases, but at identifying distant relatives, individuals sharing a sufficiently large DNA segment to indicate a common ancestor. From these initial results, the experts began building a family tree, a complex process combining genetic science with historical record research. Each family branch was constructed based on detected genetic connections, then supplemented with civil data such as birth certificates, marriage records, military files, residency records, and other public documents. The goal of building the family tree was not to immediately identify the perpetrator, but to gradually narrow the set of individuals who could be the source of the DNA sample. This process followed an elimination method, starting from the most distant relationships and progressing to closer branches. Each branch was analyzed to see whether its members fit criteria regarding gender, age, geographic location, and timing. As the family tree took shape, the number of potential individuals began to decrease from hundreds to a few dozen, and then to only a very small number who could fit biologically. Parallel to building the family tree, the investigators narrowed down related individuals based on non-genetic factors, including travel history, occupation, military service, and periods of potential access to victim Rebecca Linton. This narrowing helped quickly eliminate individuals who, despite genetic linkage, had no possibility of being present at the scene, or did not fit age and gender criteria. Each family branch was examined meticulously. Unsuitable branches were systematically excluded, based on objective data rather than speculation. This elimination process did not occur once, but was repeated each time new information was integrated into the family tree. Gradually, the genetic picture became clearer, and one specific family branch began to stand out as a convergence of multiple fitting factors. Within this branch, the investigators identified several male individuals of appropriate age for the time of the Rebecca Linton case, with residency or travel history, matching the crime location, and not excluded by any clear alibi. From this list, further elimination was performed based on additional data, including criminal records, history of violent behavior, and connections to other cases. It was at this stage that the name Edgar Holloway began to emerge as a prominent suspect, not solely due to genetic match, but due to the alarming convergence of multiple independent factors. Edgar not only fell within the genetically appropriate branch, but also had a documented history of violent behavior, appropriate temporal and geographic presence for the Rebecca Linton case, and most importantly, had been confirmed as the last person in the same space as Clara Whitlock before her disappearance. Identifying Edgar Holloway as a primary suspect was not done hastily, but was the result of an extended chain of analysis, where each unsuitable branch was eliminated until only one possibility remained that could explain all existing data without internal contradiction. The investigators and genetics experts reviewed the entire process to ensure no methodological errors occurred, as a wrong conclusion at this stage could not only derail the investigation, but also lead to serious legal consequences. Once all steps were confirmed, Edgar Holloway was officially established as the primary suspect in both the Rebecca Linton case and, by logical extension, in Clara Whitlock's disappearance. Though this conclusion did not yet carry legal accusatory weight, it marked a significant turning point. For the first time in decades, the investigators had a specific individual identified, not just by behavioral suspicion or circumstance, but by a chain of genetic evidence and scientific elimination analysis. Within the scope of this part, what was established is that genetic genealogy was applied as a central tool. The family tree was built and narrowed, unsuitable branches were systematically excluded, and Edgar Holloway emerged as the sole remaining convergence point, concluding the genetic analysis phase with a solid foundation for subsequent investigative steps, where science had pointed directly to a name that the law had previously been unable to reach. As soon as the genetic analysis results established Edgar Holloway as a key suspect that could not be ignored, the Clara Whitlock case officially crossed an institutional threshold, because what the investigators now had was no longer speculative suspicion, but a scientific evidence structure strong enough to compel the justice system to act. The decision to reopen the case came after a series of internal and interagency reviews, in which authorities examined not only the persuasiveness of the genetic analysis, but also the entire historical context of the case, previous shortcomings, and the risk of missing the final opportunity to clarify Clara's fate. Reopening the Clara Whitlock case carried profound legal significance, as it reversed the decades-long cold case status and fully restored criminal investigative authority, allowing law enforcement agencies to handle the matter as an active file, rather than an archived set of documents awaiting random leads. Immediately following this decision, a new investigative team was formed with a structure entirely different from the original 1989 team. The new team was not built on an emergency response model, but on a specialized cold case investigation model, including veteran investigators experienced in no-body cases, criminal behavior analysts, forensic officers dedicated to biological data, and legal advisors knowledgeable in modern evidence standards. This investigative team was granted unrestricted access to the entire old case file without being limited by prior assumptions, with the task of re-evaluating every detail through the lens of 2019, where forensic science, digital data, and interdisciplinary methods had completely transformed criminal investigation approaches. During the team formation process, one of the top priorities was ensuring continuity and accountability. Every member was required to thoroughly understand the case's history of errors, from the early formation of the runaway hypothesis to the overlooking of warning reports related to the family environment, in order to avoid repeating the systemic decisions that had previously led the case into deadlock. Alongside the personnel restructuring, federal coordination was elevated to a new level, as the case's key facts were no longer confined within one state. The genetic analysis involved national databases. The Rebecca Linton case occurred in Virginia, and the primary suspect, Edgar Holloway, had a history of movement and activities crossing local boundaries. This coordination enabled the sharing of legal, scientific, and strategic information among agencies, while creating a unified legal framework to implement investigative measures that had previously been impossible due to jurisdictional limits. Federal coordination also played a critical role in ensuring that all upcoming actions, from surveillance to evidence collection, could withstand court scrutiny, as investigators understood that any error in this phase could collapse the entire case. Once the organizational framework was in place, the reactivation of the criminal investigation proceeded not in a broad, scattered manner but with a highly focused strategy. The Clara Whitlock case was reclassified from a missing person file to a matter suspected of involving serious criminal elements, and all resources were directed toward verifying suspect Edgar Holloway. This did not mean presuming his guilt, but acknowledging that all existing data converged on a single individual who needed to be thoroughly verified. The investigative team conducted a complete restructuring of the case file, reorganizing documents along a real timeline rather than the old administrative order. Reports that had been ignored or downplayed were placed in their proper positions within the sequence of events. Genetic analysis results were integrated as the scientific foundation, and all data related to Edgar's behavior, criminal history, and family relationships were labeled with legal value levels, in preparation for the possibility that the file would face rigorous scrutiny by prosecutors in the future. In this phase, suspect verification priorities were specified into clear investigative objectives, including checking the consistency of old statements, cross-referencing timelines provided by Edgar with independent data, and identifying points where circumstantial evidence could be strengthened through legal methods. The investigative team agreed that all actions must aim to transform scientific suspicion into court-admissible legal evidence rather than merely accumulating more conjecture. This caution reflected lessons learned from decades of deadlock, where suspicion existed but could not cross the legal proof threshold. In strategic meetings, investigators candidly acknowledged that reopening the case did not guarantee success, but failing to reopen it would mean permanently accepting a systemic failure in which a minor disappeared from her own home without ever receiving an answer. That very awareness drove their determination to act methodically and resolutely. Within the scope of this part, what was established is that the Clara Whitlock case was officially reopened, not only procedurally, but substantively, with a new investigative team, tight federal coordination, full reactivation of the criminal investigation, and a strategy focused on verifying suspect Edgar Holloway, marking the transition from passive waiting to an active phase with clear objectives, where every step was weighed as potentially the last chance to bring the truth to light. Immediately after the Clara Whitlock case was officially reopened, and Edgar Holloway was established as the primary suspect, the investigative team entered a pivotal and decisive phase, collecting the suspect's DNA sample in a legal manner without revealing the investigation's target. At this point, any direct approach carried the risk of alerting the suspect or triggering legal disputes that could ruin the entire process. The chosen strategy was to approach Edgar in ordinary administrative contexts, unrelated to the Clara case, creating opportunities to obtain DNA indirectly without a compulsory warrant. Investigators coordinated closely to identify suitable timing and circumstances, ensuring all interactions complied with current laws. When Edgar appeared in a context involving contact with authorities not directly related to the case, investigators seized the opportunity to execute the collection plan. The selected method was indirect DNA collection from personal items Edgar had used and discarded, an approach previously recognized by courts in multiple cases, as when an individual voluntarily leaves items in public or administrative settings, they no longer have a reasonable expectation of privacy regarding biological traces on those items. The collection was conducted discreetly and in strict adherence to preservation protocols. Immediately after Edgar left, investigators secured the identified items likely bearing his DNA, sealed them on site, and recorded the time, location, and chain of custody to ensure sample integrity. The entire process was witnessed by multiple officers to prevent any future disputes over legality or potential tampering. Once the indirect DNA sample was successfully collected, the next step was to transfer it to an authorized forensic laboratory, where processing would follow strict standards, from genetic material extraction to creating a complete DNA profile suitable for comparison. Laboratory selection was based not only on technical capability, but also on legal credibility, as the results had to withstand scrutiny from defense attorneys and the court. In the lab, Edgar's DNA sample was processed alongside preserved samples from the Rebecca Linton case, with every step documented in detail to eliminate any possibility of mix-up or cross-contamination. The analysis proceeded amid tense anticipation from the investigative team, who understood this was the moment that could confirm or shatter the suspicion structure built over months. The genetic data extracted from Edgar's sample was encoded and entered into the comparison system, where it was matched against the DNA profile from the Rebecca Linton crime scene using rigorous algorithms and statistical criteria. This process was not instantaneous but required time to ensure absolute accuracy. Each genetic locus was compared, each indicator checked to determine match degree and rule out randomness. While awaiting results, investigators prepared for both scenarios. If no match, they would return to genetic analysis and re-examine the entire family tree. If confirmed, the case would enter an entirely new phase with far-reaching legal consequences. When the laboratory completed analysis and issued official results, the data showed that the DNA collected from Edgar Holloway matched the biological sample preserved from the Rebecca Linton case at a statistically indisputable level, with the probability of random match deemed extremely low. far exceeding the threshold needed for a scientific conclusion that the same individual was the source of both DNA samples. The results were independently verified by other experts to ensure no methodological errors, and when all confirmations aligned, the match conclusion was officially entered into the record. For the investigative team, this moment marked the collapse of the legal barrier that had previously prevented action, as for the first time they held direct physical evidence linking Edgar Holloway to a confirmed homicide, something they had been unable to achieve within the Clara Whitlock missing person framework. The DNA match did not merely reinforce suspicion but transformed it into solid legal grounds, opening the door to compulsory investigative measures previously unavailable. Within the scope of this part, what was established is that the suspect approach was successfully executed. The indirect DNA sample was collected and processed legally. Forensic analysis and comparison were conducted with high accuracy, and the match result confirmed Edgar Holloway as the source of DNA in the Rebecca Linton case, concluding the suspect DNA collection phase with a decisive turning point, where decades-long suspicion was finally anchored by irrefutable scientific evidence, setting the stage for stronger legal actions in the subsequent investigation. As soon as the DNA comparison results indisputably confirmed that Edgar Holloway was the source of the biological sample in the Rebecca Linton case, the entire investigative process immediately shifted to a decisive legal action phase, as for the first time in over 3 decades, authorities had not just suspicion or logical inference, but direct physical evidence strong enough to surpass all necessary legal thresholds. Prosecutors in Virginia were fully briefed on the analysis results, including the entire indirect DNA collection process, chain of custody, laboratory analysis methods, and independent verifications to eliminate any possibility of error. After thoroughly reviewing the file and assessing legal risks, the prosecutor formally drafted an arrest warrant application, submitting it to the judge with clear arguments that Edgar Holloway had probable cause to be arrested as a suspect in the murder of Rebecca Linton. The arrest warrant was approved quickly due to the severity of the charge and the robustness of the scientific evidence, accompanied by detailed instructions for execution to ensure safety, avoid conflict, and not impact expanding investigative directions related to the Clara Whitlock case. Once the arrest warrant took effect, a detailed execution plan was developed with coordination from multiple forces, including local police, cold case investigators, and federal units involved since the genetic analysis phase. The plan's goal was not only to arrest Edgar Holloway, but also to control the entire situation to prevent the suspect from destroying evidence, contacting others to align statements, or evading criminal responsibility. The arrest timing was carefully chosen based on Edgar's daily routine and safety conditions for both enforcement personnel and bystanders. The arrest took place at Edgar Holloway's residence. Officers approached in a pre-calculated formation, quickly confirmed the suspect's identity, announced the arrest warrant, and proceeded with restraint according to protocol. Edgar was clearly informed of the reason for arrest and his legal rights, including the right to remain silent and the right to an attorney. The entire process was fully documented to ensure transparency and legality. There was no significant resistance from Edgar, and in a short time he was handcuffed and removed from the residence under tight supervision, marking the first time Edgar Holloway was placed under direct law enforcement control in a serious homicide case. Concurrent with the arrest execution, relevant agencies and individuals were officially notified of the new developments, including investigative units in Connecticut, where Clara Whitlock disappeared, Virginia investigators handling the Rebecca Linton case, prosecutors from both states, and federal agencies that supported genetic analysis. This notification was not merely procedural, but aimed to ensure unified direction, avoid duplication or jurisdictional conflicts, as the case entered criminal proceedings. and allow related units to quickly adjust investigative strategies to the new legal context. Immediately after Edgar's arrest, investigative focus returned to the Clara Whitlock disappearance with unprecedented priority, as the central suspect's detention in a confirmed homicide completely altered the legal landscape surrounding Clara's disappearance. Barriers that had previously prevented investigation expansion, from lack of compulsory warrants to inability to deeply access Edgar's life and property, began to be dismantled piece by piece. Investigators in Connecticut reactivated the entire Clara file, re-examining every detail in light of Edgar's arrest for a serious crime. Timelines, old statements, and family reactions at the time of Clara's disappearance were all placed in a new evaluation framework, where the initial assumption of family safety no longer existed. The refocused investigation on Clara was not speculative but strategic, aiming to establish direct links between Edgar's proven behavior in the Rebecca Linton case and what may have happened to Clara in the Holloway family home. Investigators compiled a priority list of issues to clarify, from verifying periods when Edgar was alone with Clara to assessing inconsistencies in family members' accounts over the years. In the context of Edgar's detention, interrogation preparation was implemented methodically and cautiously. Investigators understood that arrest did not mean Edgar would cooperate, and that any mistake in interrogation could weaken the entire case in court. Thus, the interrogation strategy was built on principles of information, evidence, and psychological control, not to coerce, but to create logical gaps in the suspect's narrative. Investigators thoroughly prepared timelines, objective facts, and details only someone directly involved would know, while clearly identifying questions to ask immediately and issues to hold back for later phases to avoid revealing the full investigative strategy. Concurrently, prosecutors began considering possible legal scenarios, including Edgar choosing silence, negotiating, or cooperating only within the Rebecca Linton case. All these scenarios were accounted for in preparation to ensure the arrest was not merely symbolic, but the starting point for a series of legal actions that could lead to clarifying Clara Whitlock's fate. Within the scope of this part, what was clearly established is that the arrest warrant for Edgar Holloway was issued and successfully executed based on solid scientific evidence. Relevant parties were notified and coordinated synchronously. Investigative focus returned to the Clara disappearance with an entirely new legal foundation, and interrogation preparation was implemented as the inevitable next step, concluding the arrest phase with a historic turning point in the case, where for the first time in decades, the man once beyond the reach of the law was forced to directly confront the justice system, opening the possibility of reaching a final answer to a disappearance that had haunted for over 30 years. Immediately after Edgar Holloway was arrested and placed in custody in connection with the Rebecca Linton case, the formal interrogation process was initiated as an inevitable step to extract information related to both files, with particular emphasis on the disappearance of Clara Whitlock, because at this point, the investigators understood that Edgar's statements, whether voluntary or evasive, would play a pivotal role in determining the next direction of the case. The first interrogation session was conducted in a tightly controlled setting, with the presence of key investigators who were fully familiar with the entire file. The goal was not immediate confrontation, but to obtain initial statements and observe how Edgar chose to present his story when facing the legal system. Edgar entered the interrogation room with a cautious demeanor, not completely silent, but also not proactively cooperative. He provided information at the minimum level, focusing on denying any involvement in Clara's disappearance and dodging direct questions related to the family context in 1989. The investigators recorded the statements in detail, noting not only what Edgar said but also how he said it, the order in which information was presented, the hesitations, and the points he chose to gloss over or avoid. In the initial statement, Edgar maintained the position that Clara had left home voluntarily, repeating elements that had appeared in the old file, such as the missing items and the assumption of impulsive teenage behavior. But as the investigators listened through a new lens, they noticed that this statement was formulaic and lacked specific details, not reflecting vivid personal memories, but resembling a story that had been repeated many times over the years. Immediately after the session ended, the statement content was cross-referenced with existing data, including established timelines, past family member statements, overlooked reports, and new findings from genetic and behavioral analysis. This cross-referencing was done systematically, with each detail in Edgar's statement placed alongside independent facts to check for consistency, and it was in this step that inconsistencies began to emerge clearly. Edgar recounted the events of the evening Clara disappeared in a way that did not fully match what had been previously recorded. Timelines were shifted, the sequence of actions did not align, and some key details were omitted or altered compared to the old account. These inconsistencies were not immediately explosive, but when linked together, they formed a pattern of evasion and story adjustment in the suspect's favor. The investigators paid special attention to how Edgar reacted when asked about specific details related to the spaces in the house and the missing items, as these were elements that only someone directly involved or witnessing could describe consistently. In those moments, Edgar appeared uncertain, giving vague answers or redirecting to other topics, which was noted as a sign that the statement was not entirely based on actual memory, but possibly the result of constructing a defensive narrative. As more inconsistencies were uncovered, the investigation team re-evaluated the interrogation strategy, recognizing that the initial information-gathering approach had reached its limit, and that continuing with open-ended questions might not yield further value. Instead, the investigators began shifting the strategy toward targeted confrontation, preparing for subsequent sessions where evidence would be selectively presented to test the suspect's reactions. The strategy adjustment was not aimed at forcing an immediate confession, but at exposing irreconcilable points between the statement and objective data, thereby narrowing the space in which Edgar could continue to evade. Within the investigation team, detailed statement analysis sessions were held, where each of Edgar's responses was dissected to determine what was verifiable information, what was speculation, and what were signs of concealment. The investigators recognized that in decades-old cases, suspects often had ample time to solidify a defensive story, and breaking it required patience, consistency, and strategic use of evidence. The process of obtaining and analyzing statements in this phase did not produce a decisive confession, but it provided a psychological and logical map of how Edgar viewed the case and how he reacted to increasing legal pressure. This allowed the team to refine the approach for subsequent interrogations, identifying the topics most likely to cause fluctuation and the points the suspect could not convincingly explain when confronted with data. Within the scope of this part, what was established is that Edgar Holloway's initial statement was fully obtained and recorded. The statement content was cross-referenced with existing data, numerous inconsistencies were identified, and the interrogation strategy was adjusted to reflect the reality that the suspect was maintaining a not fully consistent defensive story, closing this phase with an important foundation for the next steps in the interrogation process, where Edgar's words, instead of clarifying the truth, had created gaps that needed to be filled with evidence and controlled legal pressure. Immediately after the initial interrogation process yielded no direct confession, but only exposed further inconsistencies in Edgar Holloway's statements, the investigation team shifted to exploiting an indirect but particularly valuable data source in decades-old cases, the suspect's personal correspondence system, while in custody. Because experience shows that when suspects believe they are communicating privately with loved ones, their legal defenses are often looser, and the details they choose to share or avoid can reveal more than formal interrogation sessions. The seizure of correspondence was carried out in full compliance with legal procedures, including all outgoing and incoming handwritten letters, especially those sent to his wife and close family members. All were copied, sealed, documented, and entered into the file with a clear chain of custody to ensure legal usability. When beginning the content analysis, the investigators approached it comprehensively, not seeking a direct confession, but focusing on language structure, tone shifts, recurring themes, and details. Edgar voluntarily introduced without prompting, as these elements often reflect what the suspect is trying to control in others' perceptions. The letter content showed Edgar continually returning to the matter involving Clara Whitlock, even though legally he was being held for the Rebecca Linton case in Virginia. This obsession was noted as a significant sign, indicating that in Edgar's mind, Clara's disappearance was not a closed event, but a constant concern needing explanation, justification, or reinterpretation. The investigators observed that in the earliest letters, Edgar used language denying responsibility, portraying himself as misunderstood, emphasizing the injustice of the situation, and being dragged into long-past matters. However, as the letter chain continued, Edgar's expressions began to change subtly. He no longer just discussed being accused, but started recounting events surrounding Clara with increasing detail. This shift did not happen abruptly but in small steps, as if Edgar was testing the level of disclosure in an environment he believed safer than the interrogation room. The letter content analysis was conducted in parallel with direct comparison to Edgar's prior formal statements. Each letter detail was placed alongside what he had said in interrogation to determine consistency, and it was in this process that stark differences began to appear. While Edgar's formal statements remained vague, avoiding specifics, and continually asserting that Clara left home on her own. In the letters he mentioned contextual elements that only someone directly involved or witnessing could know, including how spaces in the house were used, the sequence of events, and the feeling that everything had gotten out of control. These details were not presented as a confession, but they contradicted the image of someone completely unaware of Clara's fate. The investigators paid special attention to shifts in Edgar's use of pronouns and verb tenses. In many passages, he moved from objective narration to expressions, placing himself at the center of the action, even without directly admitting a role. Forensic linguistic analysis indicated that such shifts often occur when the writer is unconsciously acknowledging greater involvement than what they are willing to state to authorities. When the letters were arranged chronologically, another trend became clear. Edgar began introducing spatial and geographic details, albeit veiled in vague language, mentioning passing the same spot many times, no one noticing because it's always there, and everything has lain undisturbed for many years. These phrases were assessed not as random remarks, but as indirect hints about burial or concealment location. As the investigators cross-referenced these hints with residents' history data, locations where the Holloway family had lived, and areas Edgar could access long-term without notice, the suspect range narrowed considerably. Determining burial location information from the letters was not based on a single statement, but the result of linking scattered details, combining letter content, statement inconsistencies, and known concealment behavior from Edgar's other cases. The investigators recognized that Edgar was trying to build a consistent defensive story for his family, but that very effort forced him to provide additional explanations, and each addition made the story more complex and vulnerable to objective scrutiny. Strengthening suspicion was done by integrating letter analysis into the overall investigation file, not treating the letters as a confession, but as indirect evidence that Edgar possessed specific, detailed knowledge of Clara's fate, beyond what an innocent person could have. In internal meetings, the team assessed that Edgar's correspondence had become one of the most valuable information sources since the case reopened, as it not only provided clues to burial location, but also exposed how the suspect self-adjusted his story over time. thereby allowing investigators to more accurately predict reactions and refine subsequent interrogation strategies. Within the scope of this part, what was established is that Edgar Holloway's correspondence system was seized and comprehensively analyzed. Letter content showed significant differences and inconsistencies compared to formal statements. Indirect details related to burial location were identified and linked. And the entire analysis process strongly reinforced suspicion that Edgar was not only involved in Clara Whitlock's disappearance, but also held core information about where she was buried, closing the letter analysis phase with a major advancement where the suspect's words written in presumed privacy became the key to unlocking a truth buried for decades. From the letter analyses that gradually narrowed the suspect range for burial location, the investigation team entered the most sensitive and decisive phase of the entire case, organizing excavation based on indirect clues linked from Edgar Holloway's writings, combined with geographic and residence history data. Every preparation step for the excavation was carried out with absolute caution, as the investigators understood this was not merely a search, but a legal action capable of confirming or refuting the entire investigative structure built over years. The selected area fell within the range Edgar controlled or accessed long-term, matching the vague but repeated letter descriptions of passing many times and a place no one notices. Before excavation, forensic scene experts and forensic archaeologists were mobilized for preliminary soil layer assessment, identifying unnatural soil disturbance signs, while planning layer-by-layer digging, to ensure even the smallest evidence was properly recorded and preserved. When formal excavation began, the area was completely sealed off. Anyone without duties was excluded to prevent contamination or evidence distortion. Each soil layer was peeled away slowly and systematically. Investigators and forensic experts closely monitored every small structural change, as in decades-old secret burials. Abnormal signs are often subtle and easily missed if rushed. After hours of digging, a distinct change in soil color and texture appeared, signaling likely past artificial disturbance. Tension rose at the scene as experts ordered mechanical equipment stopped and switched to hand digging to minimize damage risk to anything below. It was in this phase that the first signs of human remains were discovered, initially just scattered bone fragments emerging from compacted soil, but enough to confirm the excavation site was not empty suspicion. The remains discovery immediately triggered stricter forensic protocols. The entire area protection range was expanded, and excavation shifted to controlled recovery. Experts recorded position, depth, and orientation of each bone fragment, as these could provide critical information about burial method, timing, and even victim state when placed. As recovery continued, the skeletal structure became clearer, indicating remains of a young person with size and proportions matching Clara Whitlock's age at disappearance. Alongside remains recovery, investigators collected all scene evidence, including fabric pieces, personal items, and foreign objects in the same soil layer. Each was marked, photographed in place, separately sealed, and entered into the custody chain for later examination. Some evidence showed signs of intentional concealment, such as materials not native to the area, reinforcing that this was not random or accidental burial, but deliberate hiding of the victim's existence. Once all remains and evidence were fully recovered, they were transferred to the forensic facility for in-depth examination. The forensic examination pursued dual goals, confirming victim identity and seeking any signs clarifying cause and circumstances of death. Forensic experts analyzed bones for age, sex, height, and other biological traits, while searching for trauma traces. Though after years buried, soft tissue signs were gone, bones could still retain key violence evidence. Examination also included accompanying evidence, especially fabric or personal items, to determine match with descriptions of items Clara reportedly took or used before disappearance. During this, investigators closely coordinated with the DNA lab for identity confirmation. DNA samples extracted from remains were carefully processed due to prolonged decomposition, but modern techniques yielded usable genetic material. This DNA was then compared to biological samples from birth mother Kathleen Price, provided earlier in the investigation. Comparison was done independently and cross-checked for absolute accuracy. While awaiting results, the team atmosphere carried particular heaviness, as though remains discovery confirmed Clara Whitlock was no longer alive. Formal identity confirmation remained the final step, turning decades-long suspicion into irreversible legal fact. When DNA results returned, they showed near absolute probability match between recovered remains and Kathleen Price's sample, confirming the excavated remains were Clara Whitlock's. This was officially recorded in the file, marking the first time in over 30 years Clara's fate was confirmed by indisputable scientific evidence. For the investigation team, identity confirmation was not just a result, but closure of a search phase full of dead ends, where a child once considered missing was finally returned. Her identity and truth. Within the scope of this part, what was established is that excavation was successfully organized and executed based on indirect clues. Human remains were discovered and recovered. Scene evidence was collected and preserved, per protocol. Comprehensive forensic examination was conducted, and Clara Whitlock's identity was scientifically confirmed, closing the remains search phase with an irreversible conclusion that the 1989 disappearance was not a mysterious runaway, but a death concealed for decades, laying the final foundation for criminal accountability steps, and closing Clara's fate file with truth, rather than assumption. Immediately after Clara Whitlock's identity was confirmed by indisputable forensic examination, the entire case officially entered the final stage of proceedings, where every scattered piece existing for over 3 decades was assembled into a complete, airtight investigative file capable of withstanding the law. The team's first task was completing the comprehensive investigation file, a non-formal task requiring extremely rigorous review, as this was the first time the Clara Whitlock case was treated as a complete homicide rather than a missing person file. All documents from 1989 to the present were reorganized by logical investigative sequence, rather than old administrative order. Initial reports, scene examination records, family statements, exclusion decisions, cold case files, genetic data, excavation results, and forensic examinations were integrated into a seamless evidence chain. Each detail was evaluated for probative value, potential rebuttal points, and needed reinforcement to avoid legal gaps. Once completed at the investigative level, the file was transferred to prosecution with clear structure, in which Edgar Holloway was identified not only as the last person controlling Clara's living space, but also as the one concealing the body, providing years of false statements, and having a violence history, matching the proven crime pattern in the Rebecca Linton case. Prosecution proceeded cautiously, but decisively. Prosecutors chose charges with highest probability, based on existing evidence, rather than overextending. The prosecution strategy focused on proving Clara died in a context of Edgar's direct intervention, that body concealment and movement were intentional, and that subsequent actions, including building and maintaining the runaway hypothesis for years, constituted systematic criminal evasion. The trial took place amid particular public interest, not for sensationalism, but because it was one of few cases where truth emerged after over 30 years through modern science combined with review of systemic errors. In court, the investigative file was presented showing case evolution over time, from an initially misdirected disappearance, to a prolonged cold case, and finally, a homicide clarified by genetic genealogy, behavioral analysis, and physical evidence. Prosecutors especially emphasized this was not a case solved by a single confession, but the result of independent yet converging evidence, each piece standing alone and together forming an irrefutable picture. Defense attempted to exploit time gaps, body decomposition, and initial investigative shortcomings to sow doubt, but the public acknowledgement and analysis of those errors in the file diminished this argument's weight. Rather than hiding them, authorities placed historical mistakes on the scale and showed how modern methods overcame them. The trial did not focus on emotion or tragedy, but revolved around core questions of criminal responsibility, the defendant's knowledge of Clara's fate, and years of concealment. As the trial concluded, the jury delivered a verdict based on scientific evidence and event logic. Edgar Holloway was convicted on charges related to Clara Whitlock's death. The sentence reflected not only crime severity, but also the prolonged time and defendant's maintenance of concealment throughout much of the victim's lifespan. Punishment ensured Edgar posed no further societal danger, while sending a clear message that time does not erase criminal responsibility. Concurrent with sentencing, authorities undertook another important self-assessment step, compiling and analyzing investigative errors across the case lifespan. The summary report did not blame specific individuals but focused on systemic issues, including early runaway hypothesis formation, lack of follow-up mechanisms for family environment warnings, then limited forensic technology, and initial lack of federal coordination. Each error was analyzed with lessons learned and applied or ongoing procedural changes to prevent recurrence. This report became an inseparable part of the closed case file, showing resolution aimed not only at individual accountability, but improving system response to similar cases. When all proceedings concluded, the Clara Whitlock case file was officially closed not as a stored cold case, but in full legal sense, where truth was established, responsibility assigned, and lessons recorded. File closure marked the end of a journey over 30 years, where a once misunderstood disappearance was restored to its true nature, no longer an open question, but a truth proven by science and law. Within the scope of this part, what was established is that the investigative file was completed and unified. Prosecution and trial proceeded on solid evidence. A sentence commensurate with the crime was imposed. Past investigative errors were transparently compiled and analyzed, and the Clara Whitlock case was officially closed, not by silence or assumption, but by a clear legal conclusion, affirming that though truth may be buried for decades, it can still be brought to light when the system is persistent enough to re-examine itself and advanced enough to correct what was once missed. From the Clara Whitlock case, a very real-world lesson in today's United States is never let a minor's disappearance slide into a runaway narrative, just because the scene shows no signs of violence. In 1989, Clara vanished right from home. The family searched everywhere before reporting to police, but the absence of struggle, and the missing small suitcase, tax refund money, and coins from June's piggy bank, made the runaway theory easily prioritized. The consequence was a frozen file, and most critically, no family DNA stored, delaying verification for many years. Practical lesson: if you are a parent, teacher, or neighbor in America, treat small signals as important data. An old report of Clara fearing going home existed, but was ignored. In real life, demand schools' child protective services record in writing, follow through persistently, and preserve every timeline, photo, item, contact. For the community, do not hesitate to ask questions when a normal family shields too tightly. Margot Holloway in the story became an invisible barrier, preventing suspicion from penetrating. And for the system, the story shows the power of modern science. Genetic genealogy, from the Rebecca Linton case in Virginia, unlocked the Clara case in Connecticut, along with Edgar Holloway's letter details inadvertently revealing, passing many times, leading to excavation. In real life, know that justice may come late, but does not arrive on its own. It requires complete records, people willing to review again, and a community that protects children through concrete action from day one. If you believe cases like Clara Whitlock deserve retelling to remind us never to forget the truth, please subscribe to the channel to join us on the journey of bringing cold cases into the light. Thank you for following to the end of this story, and see you in the next video, where we will continue facing buried secrets and lessons that should never be forgotten.